You keep telling yourself, if I'm just a little more understanding, maybe they'll change. You shrink, you silence your voice, you bend over backward trying not to upset them, not because you're weak, but because your heart is wired for peace. You've been nice, patient, forgiving. But here's the truth that's hard to face. Niceness doesn't work with someone who thrives on control. They don't see your kindness as love. They see it as permission. And every time you give in, they take more of your time, more of your energy, more of your self-worth. This isn't about being cruel or cold. It's about learning the difference between being kind and being used. You're not here to be their mirror. You're not here to keep them comfortable while you stay confused. You're here to heal, to wake up to the pattern, and to remember that your peace should never come at the cost of your power. Most people don't even realize what they're dealing with until they're deep in it. You're not just tired. You're emotionally drained, confused. Second, guessing yourself in conversations you used to handle with ease. You start wondering if you're too sensitive, too dramatic, too much, because that's what they've made you feel. But deep down, you know something's off. You're constantly adjusting yourself to avoid the next outburst, the next wave of cold silence, the next moment where you're made to feel small. And you've been taught that being nice, staying calm, keeping the peace is the right thing to do. But when you're dealing with someone who only takes, who uses your kindness like a tool, niceness doesn't work. In fact, it feeds the cycle. This conversation today isn't about becoming harsh. It's about becoming clear. It's about learning how to hold on to yourself when someone keeps trying to take you apart. You were taught to be kind, to be generous with your time, to be understanding when someone is struggling, to give people the benefit of the doubt, especially when you care about them. That's a good thing. That's your strength. But sometimes the way we're taught kindness comes with an invisible warning label, one that says you don't get to have limits. And if you grew up around people who were emotionally unpredictable or demanding, you probably learned early on that the safest way to stay connected was to keep giving even when it hurt. That's where kindness can start to turn into something else, something quieter, self-betrayal. Self-betrayal is subtle. It doesn't shout. It shows up when you say yes, but your gut is screaming no. It's when you swallow your feelings to avoid an argument. When you tell yourself it's not a big deal, even though it is, it's the part of you that lets their words slide, lets the disrespect go unchecked, because you don't want to seem cold, dramatic, or selfish. And so you keep showing up for them even as you stop showing up for yourself. If you're dealing with someone narcissistic, that pattern only gets deeper. They don't just accept your kindness. They expect it. They start treating it like a guarantee. They know you'll smooth things over. They know you'll absorb the blow. You've taught them, not because you're weak, but because you're wired for connection. You care. But over time, that kind of dynamic wears on you. You don't feel safe being honest. You start walking on eggshells. You shrink parts of yourself just to keep things nice. And that niceness, it becomes the mask you wear to survive the relationship. Here's the truth you might be afraid to admit. Kindness without boundaries isn't kindness. It's people pleasing. It's fear dressed up as patience. And the longer you keep giving from a place of fear, the more disconnected you become from your own needs, your own voice, your own worth. That's the betrayal. Not the kind where you turn against someone else, but the kind where you slowly, quietly turn against yourself. This isn't about becoming bitter. It's not about becoming cold. It's about waking up to the fact that your needs matter just as much as anyone else's. That kindness can still be strong. That boundaries are not a betrayal. They're a form of self-respect. And when someone consistently crosses those boundaries, your job isn't to keep smiling through it. Your job is to protect your peace. The hardest part, you won't get applause for this shift, especially not from the people who've benefited from your silence. They'll call you selfish. They'll say you've changed. But the truth is, you're just finally coming home to yourself. And there's nothing selfish about that. You keep having the same conversation, don't you? Different day, different words, same result. You explain how something hurt you. You try to be calm. You try to be clear. You even soften your tone just to make sure it doesn't come off the wrong way. And still, it's like talking to a wall. They get defensive. They twist your words. They make it about them. Somehow you walk away feeling like you're the problem for even bringing it up. And over time, you start to wonder, is it me? Am I not saying it right? Why can't they ever just hear me? Let's pause right there. Because that question, why won't they hear me, carries more weight than most people realize. You're not just asking about communication. You're asking about connection. about value, about whether the person on the other end actually wants to know you, or whether they only want a version of you that doesn't challenge their comfort. And that's where things get real. When someone consistently refuses to hear you, it's not because you're unclear. It's not because you're asking for too much. It's because what you're saying threatens their control, their narrative, or their sense of self. And instead of leaning in with curiosity or care, they go into shutdown or spin it back on you. That's not a communication problem. That's an emotional maturity problem. And it's not yours to fix. Here's the truth. You can't force someone to listen to what they're not willing to understand. You can cry, you can beg, you can over-explain. But if their ears are closed and their heart is guarded, all that effort just leaves you exhausted. And that exhaustion, that's a signal. A sign that you're doing the emotional labor for the relationship, not win the relationship. So what do you do when they won't hear you? You stop speaking just to be understood, and you start speaking to stay honest with yourself. You say what needs to be said, not to fix them, but to stay in alignment with your own truth. You stop repeating yourself to someone who's made it clear they're not listening, because if you keep talking just to be heard and you're never heard, you end up abandoning yourself in the process. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop chasing their understanding and start trusting your own clarity. You know how you feel. You know what you've asked for. You know what keeps happening. You don't need a perfect conversation to validate your reality. What you need is the courage to stop over-functioning in relationships that undervalue your voice. And I know that's not easy, especially when you care, especially when you've built history with someone. But staying in a loop where you're never heard doesn't build connection. It builds resentment. And your peace, your voice, your emotional safety, they deserve more than that. So speak your truth, say it once, say it clearly. And then if they still don't hear you, let that silence tell you everything you need to know. You've become the one who holds it all together, the calm one, the peacemaker. You step in before things blow up. You soften the tension with a joke, a smile, a change of subject. You tell yourself it's not worth the fight, and you let things go again and again. You've learned to keep your tone low, your emotions tucked in, and your needs quietly folded in the back of the drawer, all in the name of keeping the peace. And maybe for a while, that worked. But somewhere along the way, peace started to cost you something. And you can feel it because peace that comes at the expense of your truth isn't really peace. It's silence. And silence, when it's forced, when it's heavy, becomes resentment. You start to carry the weight of everything unsaid. Every small moment that stung but wasn't worth the argument. Every time you backed down just to make sure they didn't feel uncomfortable. Every time you smiled through a moment that hurt you deeply just to avoid making things complicated. It builds quietly, slowly, but it builds. And it's not that you don't know how to speak up. It's that every time you tried, it didn't go well. Maybe they got angry. Maybe they made you feel guilty. Maybe they shut you down with a sigh, a look, or a sharp word. So you adapted. You thought, maybe it's better if I just let it slide. And you became really good at pretending things were fine, even when they weren't. But pretending is exhausting and it's lonely because the version of peace you've been holding on to, it doesn't include you. You start to lose yourself in that kind of peacekeeping. You forget what you want. You forget what bothers you. You forget what it even feels like to be fully honest, not just with them, but with yourself. And at some point, the quiet you worked so hard to maintain starts to feel more like a cage than a comfort. You're in a room where no one's yelling, but no one's really listening either. And you're not fighting, but you're not fully living either. So here's the shift. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of honesty, of safety, of mutual respect. Real peace doesn't ask you to disappear. It doesn't require you to shrink, to suppress, or to sacrifice your truth in order to keep someone else calm. Real peace includes your voice. It includes your boundaries. It includes your needs. And that's the work, learning to speak even when it's uncomfortable. Learning to stay grounded even when someone else wants you off balance. Learning to be kind without betraying yourself. You don't need to fight to be heard. But you also don't need to fold every time there's tension. You can hold peace and still hold your ground. You're allowed to take up space in your own life. You're allowed to be fully present in your relationships, not just as the one who keeps things smooth, but as someone who's seen, known, and valued. And that kind of peace, that's the kind worth building. It never happens all at once. You don't just wake up one day and realize you're gone. It's slow, quiet. A series of small decisions you make for the sake of the relationship. You compromise on the restaurant. No big deal. You stop bringing up certain topics because they always turn into arguments. You start agreeing with things you don't fully believe in just to keep the peace. You begin showing up less as yourself and more as who you think they need you to be. And every time you make one of those choices, a small piece of you steps back. Not because you don't matter, but because you've been told in some way or another that their comfort matters more. You tell yourself it's love, that it's normal, that compromise is part of any healthy relationship. And that's true. When it's mutual, when it's safe, when both people are adjusting and listening and respecting the middle ground. But when the compromising is one-sided, when you're the one constantly shifting, softening, swallowing your truth, that's not compromise anymore. That's self-erasure. And here's what's hard to admit. Sometimes the person you're with doesn't even ask you to change directly, but their reactions, their moods, the way they pull away or blow up or make you feel small, those things train you to compromise before there's even a conflict. You start editing yourself. You rehearse conversations in your head to make sure they land the right way. You weigh your tone, your words, your timing, not because you're sensitive, but because you've learned it's not safe to be fully yourself. It starts with the little things. You stop laughing as loudly. You dress differently because they made a comment once. You stop seeing certain friends. You begin apologizing for things that aren't really yours to carry. And with each step, the space between who you are and who you've become gets wider, until one day you look at yourself in the mirror and wonder, when did I start disappearing? That's not love. That's survival. Real love doesn't ask you to shrink. It doesn't need you to be smaller, quieter, easier. It doesn't make you feel like you're too much or never enough. Real love may ask for growth, but it never demands your disappearance. And if you're sitting there feeling like maybe you've compromised too much for too long, let me tell you something, it's not too late. You don't have to blow everything up. You just have to start noticing where you've gone missing. Pay attention to the parts of you that feel dimmed, the opinions you haven't voiced, the boundaries you keep overlooking, the dreams you've put on pause. Those are clues. That's your inner voice trying to come back to life. You don't need permission to take up space. You don't need to prove your worth by staying agreeable. You are allowed to be fully, entirely yourself, and the right relationship will make space for that. Not just tolerate it, but welcome it, because love without room for you is not love you need to stay in. There's a certain kind of quiet tension that lives in the background of your relationship, the kind that makes you second guess almost everything. You feel it when you're about to bring something up, when you're deciding how to word a text, when you're walking through the door and scanning their mood before you speak. That tension becomes the air you breathe. And even though no one's shouting, no one's slamming doors, you still find yourself holding your breath. Because somehow, love has started to feel like walking on eggshells. It's the way you hesitate before being honest, the way you carry their reactions before you even say a word. You already know what will set them off, the topics, the tone, the timing. So you start adjusting, not because you're passive, but because you've been taught again and again that your honesty comes with a cost. Maybe it's sarcasm. Maybe it's silence. Maybe it's a wave of blame that makes you question whether you're the one at fault. Whatever it is, it teaches you to tiptoe around their emotions, around your truth, around yourself. And that's the part no one sees. From the outside, it might even look fine. There's no drama. You still function. You still laugh sometimes, but inside you're tired, not just physically, emotionally, because hyper-vigilance wears you down. Constantly managing someone else's comfort takes a toll on your nervous system, and over time, it chips away at your confidence. You begin to doubt your instincts. You wonder if you're too sensitive, too needy, too much. But what's really happening is this: you're carrying the emotional weight of two people. Real love doesn't feel like that. Real love doesn't make you feel like you're always one wrong sentence away from a shutdown. It doesn't make you guess how much of yourself is safe to show, and it doesn't reward your silence while punishing your truth. When love is safe, it breathes. It lets you speak without fear of emotional backlash. It lets you make mistakes without being made to feel like a burden. It lets you relax into the relationship instead of constantly trying to manage it. But here's the part that's hard to hold when you've been walking on eggshells long enough. Standing firm can feel like conflict. Raising your voice, even a little, feels aggressive. Saying no feels mean. Naming a boundary feels like betrayal. That's not a sign that you're doing something wrong. That's a sign that the dynamic has been off for a while. So what do? You start slow. You start by telling yourself the truth, that this isn't the kind of love you want to live in. That peace shouldn't have to come at the price of your presence. that your emotions, your voice, your boundaries, they're not threats. They're signals, they're reminders that you're a person with value, not a mirror for someone else's comfort. And maybe the hardest part, you start being honest even when it shakes the ground a little. Because if the only way to keep the peace is to abandon yourself, that's not peace. That's self-silencing. And you were never meant to walk on eggshells in the name of love. You were meant to walk in truth, steady, grounded, and free. You keep finding yourself in these long conversations that go nowhere. You're calm. You're careful. You choose your words with intention, maybe even rehearse them in your head before saying anything out loud. You walk them through how you feel, step by step. You even try to speak in a way that protects them from feeling blamed, because the last thing you want is another explosion or shutdown. You explain, and then explain again and again. But somehow by the end of it, you still feel like they didn't hear a word that actually mattered. And it leaves you questioning yourself. For did I say it wrong? Did I overact? Did I make it too complicated? But the truth is, this isn't about how well you communicate. This is about whether the other person is even willing to understand. There's a big difference between listening to respond and listening to connect. And when someone listens just to defend themselves, just to protect their ego, it doesn't matter how gently or clearly you speak. You still end up feeling invisible. That's the part that wears you down. You keep thinking if you can just explain it the right way, maybe they'll finally get it. So you overfunction. You do the emotional heavy lifting. You try to find examples that will make it click for them. You speak softer. You pick better timing. But every time they twist your words or shut you down, you start to internalize the message. Maybe my feelings aren't valid. Maybe they're just too much. And that quiet self-doubt becomes the prison you live in. The hard truth. People who don't want to understand you will always find a way not to. And people who want to stay in control often weaponize confusion. Because if they can keep you explaining, they don't have to take responsibility. They can make it about your tone, your timing, your delivery, anything but the actual truth you're trying to share. So what do you do when you keep explaining and still feel unseen? You stop tying your self-worth to their ability to hear you. You speak not for them, but for you. To stay clear, to stay aligned. You say it once, maybe twice if it truly needs to be said again. But after that, you pay attention. You watch not just how they listen, but how they respond. Because love shows up in action, not just in words. And if their actions continually show you that your emotions are too inconvenient to matter, then it's not your job to try harder. It's your job to see it for what it is. You deserve to be heard without having to beg. You deserve understanding that doesn't require you to justify your own reality over and over. You are not difficult for needing clarity, for needing safety, for needing connection that's real. So if you're explaining yourself and still feel invisible, maybe it's not your words that need fixing. Maybe it's the space you're saying them in. Some rooms were never meant to hold your truth. And that's not your failure. That's your freedom. You've always led with your heart. You care deeply, you give generously. And when someone you love is hurting, your first instinct is to move toward them, not away. That's who you are. And that's a strength. But when you care like that, boundaries can start to feel like barriers, like walls you're building against the people you love. And somewhere in your mind, it feels like drawing a line means closing a door. Like if you say no, you're abandoning them. Like if you pull back, you're being cold. So instead, you keep stretching, you keep bending, you keep giving, even when it hurts. And then the resentment shows up, quiet at first, but real. Because the truth is, there's only so long you can override your own needs before your body starts keeping the score. You're more tired, more reactive, less present. You love them, but you start to dread the conversations. You brace yourself before answering the phone. You find yourself walking away from interactions feeling drained instead of grounded. And what's hardest is that you still care. You still want to show up. You just don't know how to do it without losing parts of yourself in the process. This is where the deeper shift happens, where you begin to understand that boundaries aren't about pushing people out. They're about keeping you in, keeping you intact. Boundaries aren't punishments. They're not emotional ultimatums. They're clear, compassionate limits that say, I can love you and still protect my peace. I can care about your feelings without abandoning my own. It's not either or, it's both and that tension, that ability to hold both your heart and your limits, that's where emotional maturity lives. But here's what they don't always tell you. The people who benefited from your lack of boundaries will not applaud when you start setting them. They might call you distant, difficult, selfish. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because the dynamic is changing. And change, even healthy change, feels uncomfortable to people who have gotten used to access without accountability. You have to know that ahead of time, or you'll start second guessing yourself the moment they push back. Setting boundaries while keeping your heart open means staying grounded in your intention. You're not pulling away to punish, you're creating space so the relationship doesn't keep running over your emotional well-being. It means saying, this is what I need to feel safe. This is what I can and can't offer. And I'm saying this not to hurt you, but to honor me. It's okay if it feels hard. It's okay if your voice shakes. You're allowed to feel the weight of it. But don't confuse discomfort with cruelty. You are not being unkind for choosing clarity. You are not breaking connection by protecting yourself. In fact, the most honest relationships are built on those clear lines, where both people are free to show up fully, not out of obligation, but out of respect. You can love deeply and still have limits. You can be kind and still say enough. And the people who truly see your heart, they'll understand that your boundaries aren't a rejection. They're an invitation to love you in a way that honors both of you. You say, sorry, more than you realize. Not just when something's your fault, but when something feels tense. When someone seems upset. When a conversation gets uncomfortable, you apologize to smooth things over, to de-escalate, to keep the peace. And somewhere along the way, that word, or sorry, stopped meaning, I take responsibility, and started meaning, please don't be mad at me. Please don't leave. Please let this pass. That's when apologizing stops being a moment of ownership and starts becoming a survival strategy. You learned it somewhere. Maybe growing up in a home where emotions ran hot and unpredictable. Maybe in a relationship where your pain was always dismissed, so you figured it was easier to just take the blame. You realized early on that the fastest way to safety was to fall on the sword, even when it wasn't yours to carry. It became a reflex. Keep the waters calm, keep them comfortable, keep yourself small. And at first, it feels like it works. The tension goes down, the conversation shifts, they stop being cold or distant or angry. You breathe a little easier. But what you don't realize is that every time you apologize just to restore peace, you're trading a piece of your dignity for temporary relief. You're absorbing emotions that don't belong to you. You're shouldering responsibility just to stay in someone's good graces. And over time, that builds into something heavy, something unfair. Because deep down, you know you're not always the one at fault, but it feels safer to carry the blame than to risk being seen as difficult, demanding, or unlovable. That's not apology. That's self-protection. Real apology comes from clarity, from knowing what's yours and what's not, from standing in your truth without needing to minimize it to make someone else feel better. And when you start waking up to this pattern, it can feel disorienting. Because if you stop saying, sorry, what will happen? Will they get angrier? Will they pull away? Will the relationship survive your boundaries? These are real fears, not because you're fragile, but because you've learned to equate apology with safety, with connection, with acceptance. But here's the truth you may need to hear today. If a relationship depends on you constantly apologizing to stay intact, it's not a relationship built on love. It's built on imbalance. And love that requires you to take blame just to keep someone close is not love that sees you fully. So take a breath. Start noticing when you say, sorry, and ask yourself, did I actually do something wrong? Or am I just trying to feel safe again? You don't have to stop cold turkey, but you can pause. You can replace the apology with honesty. I feel tension here. Can we talk about what's happening? That's still peacekeeping, but without losing your voice. You're allowed to be in relationships where accountability goes both ways, where you don't have to earn closeness by erasing yourself. Where sorry isn't your shield, but something sacred and true. You don't have to keep apologizing just to be loved. You just have to start standing in the kind of love that doesn't ask you to. You're kind by nature. It's how you move through the world. You don't just think about how things affect you. You feel how they affect everyone else. You listen when others need to be heard. You give people the benefit of the doubt. You show up when you're needed. You lead with compassion, even when you're tired. And you really try, to make things easier for the people you care about. That's not a weakness, that's a strength. But sometimes that very strength becomes the doorway people walk through to take more than they give. To expect your kindness, not as a gift, but as something they're owed. It doesn't start big, it's subtle. Maybe someone makes a demand and you give in because you don't want tension. Maybe they make a comment that stings and you let it slide because it's not worth starting something. Maybe they shift the blame during an argument and instead of holding your ground, you smooth it over. Not because you're wrong, but because you want peace. And slowly, they start learning that they can cross the line without consequence. that your kindness means you won't push back, that you'll absorb the discomfort so they don't have to. And here's what's tough to admit. Sometimes we teach people how to treat us without even realizing it, not through our words, but through what we allow, what we excuse, what we overlook in the name of staying kind. And before you know it, you're in a dynamic where being kind isn't just exhausting. It's how you're being controlled. You start feeling responsible for their emotions. You shrink in conversations just to keep things calm. You silence your own needs so they don't feel uncomfortable. And here's the real kicker. You start confusing kindness with compliance. You think that to be a good partner, friend, sibling, or child, you have to be agreeable. You have to say yes. You have to keep the energy light even when something inside you is heavy. But that's not kindness. That's fear wearing a polite smile. Kindness is generous, but it's not submissive. Kindness is open-hearted, but it's not boundaryless. Kindness can say, I love you, and that's not okay. It can say, I want connection, but not at the cost of my self-respect. True kindness includes truth, and the moment you start cutting off your honesty, your dignity, your voice, just to stay in someone's good graces, that's the moment your kindness stops being healthy and starts being a way to keep yourself emotionally safe. So how do you stay kind without being controlled? It starts by separating who you are from how others react. You can be deeply compassionate and still say no. You can love someone and still hold a boundary. You can care about how they feel without carrying the full weight of their feelings on your back. That's not cold. That's clarity. That's maturity. The key is to stop making your kindness dependent on how someone else responds. You don't need to keep softening your truth just because someone else can't sit with their discomfort. That discomfort is their teacher. And every time you step in to fix it, to cushion it, to absorb it, you're robbing them of a lesson they probably need. You're doing the emotional work for two people. And over time, that's not just exhausting, it's unsustainable. Think about the last time you said yes when you wanted to say no. Not because you were okay with it, but because you didn't want to deal with their reaction. What did that cost you? Your time, your peace, your self-respect. That's the control I'm talking about. Not some obvious manipulation, but that subtle, invisible pressure you feel to keep being kind or else they get upset, or else they withdraw, or else you're made to feel like the villain for having limits. You don't owe anyone constant access to your kindness if they use it to avoid accountability. You don't owe anyone your emotional labor if they never offer it back. Kindness must be mutual, or it turns into quiet servitude. And love that expects you to keep giving while never adjusting to your boundaries isn't love. It's entitlement dressed up in emotional dependency. And maybe for a long time, you were told that being kind meant being liked. That being kind meant keeping the peace. That being kind meant never saying, that hurt me. But I want you to hear this clearly. You can be kind and still be direct. You can be kind and still be honest. You can be kind and still disappoint people. Because if your kindness always has to be comfortable for the other person, it's not real, it's not grounded, it's performance, not presence. You are not selfish for having limits. You are not rude for telling the truth. You are not unkind for choosing your mental health over someone else's convenience. And the people who truly value you, the ones who really see your heart, will not just tolerate your boundaries, they'll respect them. Because they'll understand that kindness without choice isn't kindness, it's obligation. So the next time you feel that tension, that pull to overgive, to over-explain, to smooth it all out, take a moment and ask yourself is this really kindness? Or is this fear? Am I giving from love or from the hope that if I'm nice enough, they won't hurt me? Those answers matter because your safety matters, your peace matters, and your kindness was never meant to be used as currency to buy love that should have been freely given. You can stay kind, but let that kindness come from a place of strength, not survival. Speak gently but truthfully. Show grace but don't abandon your limits. Offer your love but hold your line. That's what it means to love yourself and others well, not from fear, not from obligation, but from clarity, courage, and self-respect. And that's the kind of kindness no one can take from you. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It doesn't feel still. It doesn't offer rest. Instead, it stirs up anxiety in your chest and makes you question everything you thought you knew. It's not the kind of silence where two people sit comfortably, knowing their connection doesn't always need words. It's the kind of silence that feels like a punishment, like being locked out emotionally and not told why. And over time, that silence stops just being about them not speaking. It becomes something deeper, something heavier. You start carrying their silence like it says something about you. You walk into the room and feel the emotional temperature drop. You replay your last words over and over in your head, trying to figure out what you said wrong. You scan their face for clues. Were they irritated, hurt, distant? You ask if they're okay and they say, "I'm fine." But you know they're not. And then you're left alone in the confusion, no explanation, no clarity, just a wall where there used to be warmth. And here's the thing, the human brain doesn't like uncertainty, it craves patterns. It needs to make sense of things. So when someone we care about goes silent, when they emotionally pull back without saying a word, our brain doesn't just sit with that silence. It fills it with stories, with fears, with self-blame. You start wondering if you were too much or not enough. If you said something wrong, if you're the reason they're pulling away, their silence becomes the canvas and your insecurity becomes the paint. And you don't even realize it, but you start editing yourself in response. You talk less, you tiptoe. You stop sharing your truth because you're scared it will push them further away. You shrink. You apologize for things you don't even understand just to pull some kind of response out of them. You keep reaching and they keep receding. And the longer it goes on, the more their silence starts to echo something inside you that was already tender. Something about worth, about lovability, about whether you're too hard to love. And that's the danger of this kind of silence. Not just that it creates distance, but that it quietly convinces you that you're the problem. When the truth is, silence in relationships can be a form of emotional control, especially when it's used not to reflect or process, but to punish, to withhold, to shift power. Some people don't raise their voice. They just take their voice away. And in doing that, they leave you carrying all the weight of their emotions without any of the tools to understand them. And I want you to hear this. That's not healthy. That's not love showing up in a mature, grounded way. That's emotional avoidance wrapped in a quiet kind of manipulation. Healthy love communicates. It doesn't vanish emotionally and expect you to guess what went wrong. It doesn't put you in the position to do all the emotional labor. It doesn't use silence as a weapon or as a way to control the dynamic. It leans in, not away. Now, of course, people process differently. Some folks need space to gather their thoughts. Not everyone is ready to talk right away, and that's okay. But there's a difference between I need a moment and I'm going to punish you with my absence. There's a difference between taking space with communication and taking space to create confusion. If you've been on the receiving end of that kind of silence, I want you to know your job is not to decode their moods. Your job is not to perform emotional gymnastics to win back connection. Your job is not to silence yourself just to avoid triggering more silence from them. That's not love. That's survival mode. And when you live like that long enough, something subtle and dangerous begins to happen. You stop trusting your gut. You stop trusting your feelings. Because every time you try to speak up, every time you try to name what's missing, it's met with more withdrawal, more silence, more denial. And so you begin to question, am I too sensitive? Am I imagining this? Maybe it's not that bad. And that's the trap. You slowly become disconnected from your own inner knowing. You start gaslighting yourself because someone else's refusal to engage made you doubt your reality. But here's the truth. Relationships are built in the in-between, in the repair after rupture, in the hard conversations, in the choosing to show up even when it's uncomfortable. Silence might buy someone short-term control, but it robs the relationship of long-term trust because connection doesn't grow where there's confusion. It grows where there's clarity, vulnerability, and mutual effort. So if you're sitting in a relationship where silence feels louder than words, where you're doing all the emotional lifting and still feeling unseen, I want to tell you something that may be hard to hear. You can't carry the whole relationship on your back. You can't keep chasing someone who doesn't meet you halfway. You can't keep shrinking to fit into a space where only parts of you are allowed. And maybe part of why you stay is because their silence makes you long for the version of them that used to show up. The version that laughed with you, that looked you in the eye, that held your hand without hesitation. You're not just holding on to them, you're holding on to hope. The hope that if you just explain better, if you just love harder, if you just stay quiet a little longer, maybe they'll come back. But people don't come back through silence. They come back through accountability, through effort, through healing. And if they're not willing to do that, you can't keep sacrificing your peace trying to make the relationship feel alive again. You deserve to be in a relationship where you don't have to wonder if you matter, where your voice doesn't echo into silence, where your presence is met, not avoided. And until you're in that kind of space, I want you to start treating yourself like someone who matters. Speak kindly to the parts of you that feel ignored. Validate your own confusion. Sit with your own pain and say, this isn't crazy. This isn't too much. This is real. And if you need to say that out loud, do it. Because the healing begins the moment you stop asking someone else's silence for permission to feel what you feel. Their silence is not your fault. Their emotional withdrawal is not a reflection of your worth. Their inability to communicate is not a reason to doubt your voice. And if being in this relationship makes you feel like you're losing touch with who you are, that matters. That's not something to ignore. That's your spirit waving a flag, saying, this isn't love. This is fear, so take your power back, not by yelling, not by begging, but by choosing to stop dancing around their silence like it's your job to break it. Let your clarity be louder than their distance. Let your boundaries be louder than their moods. Let your truth be louder than the stories fear tries to tell you. Because when someone's silence turns into your self-doubt, it's no longer about connection. It's about control. And love doesn't need you to disappear to keep it intact. Love asks you to stay present, to yourself first, and then to whoever is willing to meet you there.